Saludos. It's your host, Gabe Morales. We have a very interesting show for you today. We're going to talk about the Fresno Bulldogs. There's still some debate today exactly when the Bulldogs started. I have some solid info on them for you, and I think I can piece together a credible historical evolution for you. As many of you know, I worked at New Folsom from 1987 to 1993, and it was there that I saw the evolution of the Bulldogs and encountered some of the original members. We received a lot of inmates from San Quentin, several who were on the Bulldog Council, and so I talked to them as well as read their C files. This is the confidential section of their inmate files. The F-14 first started as a street regiment in Fresno, California. This was designated by the NF as a test regiment for the rest of the organization. And Crackers Vindiola, well-respected NF member, was put in charge of this project. He was a captain under NF General Babo Sosa at the time. Assisting him was Ruben Carnica and Ruben Ceja Guerrero. Ruben's brothers Juan and Jesse were NF associates at the time and assisted him. The first time I know that the F-14 was ever documented was about 1976. I totally believe that it could have started a couple years earlier. So I put a date probably of no earlier than 74, no later than 1975. When you consider that Babo Sosa really only took charge in 73. But it wasn't too long when Crackers was told he had to give up the keys to Sammy Venegas. Sammy was a well-known drug dealer, and Babo's big thing was dealing drugs. That was the NF's moneymaker. However, they also taxed prostitutes, pulled robberies, and other crimes that brought in money for the organization. Now, a percentage of this money was supposed to go to the NF banks. That never happened as written in the Constitution, and it was a big reason why Babo and his number two man, Death Row Joe, later fell from power. It didn't take too long when some of the local Fresno gangsters, including some NF, started complaining about oppression, too much taxation, and too many deaths for those who didn't pay up in time or refused to pay. They also protested the death of their brothers, and by that I mean literally. Sammy's little brother, Lupe Venegas, was killed by the NF on January 6, 1976. The bodies were dropping left and right, ones, twos, and threes. On two occasions, December 1977 and in 1980, the NF tried to take Sammy out as they felt he wasn't fulfilling his duty. So he convinced his brother, Joe Cucaracha Venegas, to defect from the NF with him. Another big drug dealer at the time was Alfred Oso Rivas, who operated in Fresno, but also had connections to Gilas. Gilas was the home base for Black Bob Vasquez and Ezequiel Conejo Lopez, who ended up doing a successful campaign to impeach Babo Sosa and Death Row Joe. You also had the Gutierrez family operating in Fresno. I dealt with Angel Gutierrez when I worked at New Folsom Prison. You also had Pistol Pete Gutierrez, who was killed many years later by the NF's ruthless Skip Villanueva at the federal BOP at Pollock, Louisiana, on January 4th, 2008. It is my understanding that Frank Flaco Pino was put in charge around 1980 after Sammy Venegas fell out. I had Flaco in C facility at New Folsom in 1991, and he was running with the Bulldogs then. Another NF member that was put in bad standings from Fresno was Adolf Kabubi Duarte. I'll talk about him more in just a bit. So the Fresno regiment was bringing a lot of money at first, but like I said, then you started having people protest and complaining about the NF's oppression. Several efforts were made in the late 1970s and early 80s, like with Flaco, to bring the Fresno regiment back online. But many still resisted and said what was happening was no different than the Mexican Mafia's oppression and the reason why the NF started in the first place. It was also about this time that there was a RICO case put on the West Familia, the first RICO in California ever. This case swooped up Babo, Death Row Joe, and a whole bunch of other people, including many from Fresno. So with the impeachment and the RICO case, the NF went from over 700 members, really deep at the Dual Vocational Institution at Tracy, as well as a few other places, and they dwindled down to barely over 100. Now, you have to understand, not all Fresno F-14 left. By the way, one of those that left out of town was my neighbor. His name was Manuel Orozco. He liked to ride bikes. On his motorbike was a Welga Bird and F-14 on it. That was 1978 in Yakima, Washington. Manuel liked to shoot up. He actually was a pretty good guy and a poet. It just so happens that my other neighbor was the brother of a Norse Familia captain, and another neighbor was Animal from the Ghost Riders. That was quite a place. And that quadruplex was located on 4th and G in Yakima. It is now torn down. And you had Frank Pancho Alejandres, who was the NF captain from Fresno, who was active for about 20 years until he dealed. Now, I'm one who has always felt one should not be guilty just because related to somebody or guilt by association. But Pancho's brother was none other than Daniel Nane Alejandres, who was the founder of Barrios Unidos, which has been located many years in Santa Cruz, California, and has chapters all over the Western United States. Another person who I knew very well from Yakima was the Washington State Barrios Unidos chapter leader, Alex Santillanes, rest in peace, as well as his nephew Pepe, who's from Salinas, who attended classes with me at Yakima Valley College. But back to my story here. Not all Fresno F-14 left the Norse Familia. Some of them stayed loyal, and some of them stayed as part of the Fresno car in the northern structure in the mid-1980s. I dealt with several of these individuals personally. These were people like Eddie Blackneck Martinez, Jaime Shorty Corpus, who was deemed no good by 1994. You had Eddie Player Ortiz, Blackneck Garza, Joe Gibby Sanchez, and Rudy Quito Herrera, all listed as northern structure from Fresno. As I recall, they're also listed on a roster that was given up by NF defector Louis Dumptruck Chavez, who gave this NF-NS roster to his parole agent. Another name from Fresno on that list was Gabriel Reaper Coronado, and he rode the NS car until he was hit in the Santa Clara County Jail in 1998. You also had Michael Mikio Alvarez, who was considered one of the top NF shot callers in the BOP, who was from Fresno. You had the Rodriguez family, Charlie Brown and Night Owl, both who were loyal to the NF and the northern structure long after the Bulldogs formed. I think maybe Anthony Negro Rodriguez was also related to those guys. Let me know if that is correct. All I recall was that Charlie Brown and Night Owl ran with a crew called the Midnighters. I can't remember exactly, but they may have been even a car club. You old veteranos from Fresno, let me know what's up with that. So like I said, in New Folsom, I met a lot of these guys from Fresno. I would always pull cards. Anybody who's Fresno, I would document if they're pro-Bulldog or anti-Bulldog. One of the individuals who was very vocal about being against the Bulldogs was a guy named Rooster Moreno. I remember Rooster being pretty tall, dark, lots of tattoos. And although there was a Fresno Northern Structure car there, they were outnumbered by the Bulldogs. And I remember him having a lot of heated discussions with them out in the yard where I thought they were going to go to blows. Now, you have to understand that Fresno is a big city, and the Fresno car was huge. So the North Familia did not want to lose that region, and they fought very hard to keep it. But like I said, by then, the majority of Fresneros were fed up and wanted no part of the NF. So they started forming the Bulldogs at San Quentin Prison in the early 1980s. This idea started off slowly. They adopted the mascot of Fresno State University, which is a bulldog. Fresno State University's colors are red, so it was hard to tell a lot of times who was bulldog and who was North Familia Northern Structure. The way I was able to tell them apart is at yard recall, the Fresno Bulldogs would bark, and I mean loud. They did this when they came on the yard and when they left the yard. This was their call sign. Now, not all bulldogs were enough dropouts. A lot of them were too young, but the older ones basically told them what was up. And I would say most of the youngsters followed the split. Now, Crackers Vindiola had a real solid rep. He was one of the guys who were at Chino's Palm Hall when they killed Cheyenne Cadena, who was an icon for the Mexican Mafia. This was the guy that the movie American Me was based on, played by Olmos as the character Santana. Only one thing, it didn't happen like it did in the movie. He wasn't killed by his own. He was killed by the NF. And Crackers ended up throwing one of Cheyenne Cadena's bodyguards off the tier. Cheyenne Cadena was killed like in the movie, stabbed multiple times by NF members, Joker Mendoza and Apple Manzanas, and thrown off the tier. That part they got right. In that same movie, William Forsythe plays the character JD. JD portrayed Joe Morgan. Now, Joe Morgan would have never had Cheyenne Cadena killed. Cheyenne Cadena was like a son to him. So it was for that reason, and a couple of sodomy scenes, that some of the people who were advisors for that movie got into trouble and were killed. Now, there are some that say that wasn't the reason, but I believe that was part of it. Now, Crackers had put in a lot of work for the NF, and he earned his North Familia tattoo. It's interesting to me that after he left the organization, he kept that tattoo on as a badge of honor, and he kept it on the rest of his life. But he also knew that a lot of his Fresno homeboys had no love for the NF. Now, contrary to what some people say, Crackers did not start the Bulldogs. But I tell you what, they would have never happened if he hadn't given it his stamp of approval. In other words, he never told them, don't do it. We also had his brother Roy Spooky Vindiola there at New Folsom Beef Facility, and he was heavily involved in this decision. When Crackers left the NF, he took his brothers with him, Indio, Shadow, and Spooky. Now, when these Bulldogs first split, they looked at the Sureños as allies because the Sureños, of course, have always fought the Norteños since the late 1970s, early 80s. But the Vindiolas did not approve of Bulldogs kicking it with Sureños. Some of the first inmates with the Fresno car were also part of the council were Tony Big G Zadere, Leonard Rocco Ruiz, Mike Chicago Reyes, and Ricky Animal Garza. I had all these guys in New Folsom Sea Yard. And what happened was a lot of these guys had problems at San Quentin with the NF and Northern Structure. So they transferred them to New Folsom, starting in 1987. I was a brand new fish cop, but I quickly learned who was who. Like I said, a lot of the older Fresno guys that were affiliated with the Nuestra Familia as carnales or as associates also joined the split. Among these was Angel Gutierrez, who I mentioned previously, who came from a very well-known family in Fresno. You had Silk Vargas. I remember Silk would always have a toothpick. We didn't give him toothpicks, but he made a toothpick out of grass. And he would always have that in observing the yard. You had classic Bob Reyes, who was a pretty quiet guy, older, and was an advisor for the youngsters. You had Boo Boo Ortega, who was a little bit younger than him. Smiley Estrada, who was very active, tall, lanky. You had Local McPeters, who always walked with a cool strut. Caveman Madrid, who was pretty buffed. Benny Velasquez, who wasn't that big, but was a big drug dealer in the yard. You had Crow Garcia, who was kind of a spokesman for the Bulldogs. You also had two other interesting individuals I had in the yard. One was named Pollo or Paya Duarte, whose older brother was Kabubi, that I mentioned earlier, who was deemed no good by the NF. Their father-in-law was Alfonso Ponce Palomino, a member of the Mexican Mafia. And you had another individual named Armando Mausi Morales, no relation to me. Both Duarte, via his father-in-law, and Morales, via his connections, had built a relationship with the Sureños and Mexican Mafia associates. And so these two guys pushed a new movement called the Fresno Bulldog Nation, or FBN. The intention of this group was to unite with the Sureños and Mexican Mafia to fight against the Nuestra Familia and Northern Structure. One day I hit Mausi and his celly, and I found a really detailed roster of Nuestra Familia, Northern Structure, Mexican Mafia, and associates, as well as Fresno Bulldog supporters. I confiscated them, wrote up a CDC 128 informational chronicle, as seen here, and I gave it to the Folsom Gang Unit Sergeant Donna de la Garza. I still stay in contact with Donna. She's really good people, and she's one of the few that ever thanked me for my work on gangs there at New Folsom. A lot of guys, frankly, had the attitude that I was interfering in their business, but I was a yard officer there. I worked the units, and I was one who paid attention, like I said, to who was who. And so I saw a lot of things. I wrote a lot of key reports, and I still pay attention, as you can tell by this video. Now, you will hear from some California gang investigators saying that I never was a gang investigator. Well, I've been investigating gangs all my life. To me, every officer should be a gang investigator. This is something that one of my friends, Lou Savelli from NYPD gang unit during 9/11 said, that every cop needs to be a gang investigator. And I agree. Unfortunately, a lot of these guys in the gang squad become like prima donnas and treats anybody who's not in the gang unit really bad. This is a bad situation because I know they're at New Folsom. A lot of officers wouldn't even talk to the gang unit when they had some really good information. And this is bad because that's how bad things happen. If you look at 9/11, there was a lot of analysts who knew about those guys, but they didn't even bother reporting it up the chain of command because they did before and it was ignored. This is how you get low staff morale and how convicts can take charge of an institution. So I never looked at it like I was interfering. What am I supposed to do? Look the other way? Stuff is happening right in front of me. So when I hear a lot of things about the Bulldogs, I'm like, no, that isn't how it went down. I was there when it happened. I remember one occasion when there was a fight. It was two Bulldogs on a Northern Structure. The yard gunner put the yard down. All the convicts got down, as is routine in those situations. And responding officers cuffed up the two Bulldogs in the Northern Structure. There was an overtime sergeant working there who was getting ready to call resume yard on the radio, but I stopped him. So wait a minute, Sarge. I looked around and I saw nothing but Northern Structure and Fresno Bulldogs all over the place in that area. So even though the sergeant outranked me, I ordered responding staff to search everybody that I pointed out. And sure enough, they all had hand wounds, stab wounds, all kinds of stuff was going on during that fight. But the gunner had tunnel vision, so he can only see those three. This is very typical if you ever work a gun post. Normally, you will scan the yard, but when stressed, you will zero in on a certain area. So he must have totally missed the other fights. Or maybe he wasn't paying a lot of attention, because these guys will test which gunner they will do things in front of. They will play fight. And if the gunner is paying attention, then they know that's not where to do it. If the gunner is eating his food or out of the window, they know that's the guy to do it in front of. I think both convicts and officers who have ever been in that situation will agree. So we rolled up a whole bunch of Bulldogs in Northern Structure after that incident. Like I said, more and more Bulldogs were coming in. We did have a lot of Northern Structure also, but the Bulldogs ended up taking over the yard from the Northern Structure in West Familia and New Folsom Sea Yard. In fact, the Bulldogs had so much power that by 1991, the inmate facility newsletter was named the Bulldog Edition. So like I said, I watched the Bulldogs evolve there at New Folsom Prison. I also talked to a lot of officers that came in from other facilities, including San Quentin. I talked to convicts, and a lot of people say, hey, convicts won't give you a real story. Well, I think they will if you give them a little respect. Nobody wants to look like a snitch, but they would tell me things here and there that I pick up on, or I pick up on it, even if they didn't say so. And I've said this before in a lot of my other videos, because verbiage is only a small part of communication. Your tone and your body language says a whole lot more. And I communicated with the Fresno County Jail. In fact, I brought in some of the gang investigators from the Fresno County Jail to our first gang conference in Seattle for the International Latino Gang Investigators Association. This occurred in 2002, and they had interviewed a lot of people. I got copies of major debriefs from Corcoran and Pelican Bay, so I was able to keep tabs on all these guys I dealt with, as well as many others that I never dealt with. They were key players in the Fresno Bulldogs. I was advised that later, Mousy Morales was sent to the federal BOP, and he's changed his moniker to Mariachi. He actually was kicking it with Northern Structure, and I have several pictures where he's standing together with them, feeling very comfortable. Well, when he was known as Mousy, he was very high on the NF Northern Structure hit list for his movidas. Now, in CDC, Bulldogs cannot get along with Northern Structure or West Familia. They are fully independent, and they've always wanted their own yards. But in the federal BOP, there's not that many Fresneros, and there's not a lot of Norteños either. So I'm told that some Fresneros can function on yards with Northern Structure, as long as they don't talk that Bulldog line. And so apparently Morales was low profile and kept his mouth shut. But evidently they must have done a background check on him and found out who he really was. So he got jumped and beat down real bad in 2005. And so, like I said, the Bulldogs today, they're very active. They're active. When I was there at New Folsom, I watched them evolve and become stronger and stronger. Their numbers are way up now. So I would definitely not call them a dropout gang. They're part of a split from the NF, but they are very active. And CDC has a hard time housing them to this very day. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'll give you a little bit of history. I have a lot more in my book on the West Familia that's available online via Amazon.com and other platforms. Steve Morales signing off for Gangsters, Cops, and Politicians.